It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my very special guest is Andrew Clavin, and we're going to be discussing his new book, The Truth and Beauty: How the Lives and Works of England's Greatest Poets Point the Way to a Deeper Understanding of the Words of Jesus. That may be the longest subtitle I've had on the show in a while. Andrew, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Well, and on the one hand, I want to say Andrew is an author who needs no introduction. I am so familiar with his podcast and his content for many years, but I know for some of you who watch and listen to the show, this is going to be the very first time you are meeting him. So we're going to kick this off by having him share a bit of the Andrew Clavin origin story. So for somebody meeting you for the first time, give them a little context. What are a few things they should know about you?
Well, I come from far away, I guess I should say. I started out as a secular Jew, meaning a non-believing Jew who was I was a crime writer, a mystery story writer, suspense writer. My books did well, and they were made into movies with Clint Eastwood and Michael Douglas. But all along, I was searching for something I knew from the very beginning. I was searching for something that would elevate my thought and my experience of life beyond what I was seeing around me, which was pretty depressing and kind of mired in this idea that there was no such thing as truth, there was no such thing as morality. And I knew those things by instinct weren't true. And slowly, very slowly, really, over the years, I was led to Jesus Christ. And I was 49 when I was baptized. And it was a huge turning point in my life, an amazing movement into a serenity and joy I had never expected to find in my life. My wife of now many, many decades turned to me about 3 weeks after my baptism and said, "You're an entirely new person." I said, "Well, that's what they told me, how they told me it worked." So there it is. And since then, I've been wrestling with how to do the kinds of things I know how to do, which are tough, hard stories about, criminals and detectives and reporters and things like that, and how to do them in such a way that they reflect what I now see as a sort of another level of reality to the world. And it's been a real journey of craft, both craft and art and inspiration. And it's been incredibly exciting. This book, which I've been wanting to write for years and years and years, is a real labor of love. So it's really something that has been gestating in me for a very long time.
Well, and one thing I always like to ask when I have somebody who moonlights between both fiction and nonfiction, I'm always curious, is there one that's easier for you? Does one inform the other? Because not everybody can work in both of those spaces.
It's really interesting because I wrote this book and a novel, When Christmas Comes, very close together. And writing this book, it was like standing on a laser point. I knew I was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. It was incredibly fulfilling. My prayer life became almost silent because I felt I was in complete communication. There was nothing else to say. There was nothing I could put into words except the words I was putting on the page. Right after that, at the suggestion of an editor friend of mine, he wanted me to write a Christmas mystery, which I'd always wanted to do. And I sat down to write that. And that was just incredible fun. You're making up stories, you're creating characters, but it was a very different experience. I think the experience of nonfiction, I won't say one is harder than the other, but nonfiction is more technical than fiction. You really have to know what you're talking about. You have to check every word you say, every fact you make reference to. You're going to be hit by people who are more expert than you are. And so you really want to be doing, it's really like operating, like being a surgeon. Whereas fiction does have a certain kind of freedom to it. That's just a very beautiful experience. I've always loved writing prose in general, but I always especially love writing fiction.
Well, I like what you said about kind of gestating a message. If I had $1 for every time I talk to an author about, you're kind of pregnant with something and it's growing and it's growing. And, I feel like in Divine Providence, there's a timeliness. Almost every book project I've worked on in the past 10 years in Christian publishing, even though the contract gets signed long before the book comes out, in the season that these books often come into the market, it's what is needed culturally. It's how God is moving. And so there is that mysterious divine timeliness of books where sometimes people will carry things for decades, and then it comes out in that season when the author has the fullness that they're ready to share. I'm curious for you in terms of the season of wrestling that you walk through, wrestling with the Gospels, wrestling with kind of the Sermon on the Mount. I love what you have in the opening part of the book. You quote your son Spencer saying, maybe the problem is that you're trying to understand a philosophy instead of trying to get to know a man. And I've just thought of that. That's just kept me thinking the past few weeks how often we approach faith trying to understand kind of a system and a philosophy, and completely missing Jesus the man.
It is really true. Until he said those words to me, it had never really occurred to me. I've read a lot of philosophy. I know how to deal with philosophy, but getting to know a person is really different. And it's a very different experience. And to do it, I say it's a kind of a humble brag that I taught myself how to read Greek so I could read the Gospels in the oldest language we have. But I taught myself, I'm so bad at it that I was scratching through 5 lines a day. But slowing it down like that gave me this fresh experience of kind of like what would happen if you read a memoir or a novel or a biography and you were just trying to get to know this character and putting everything else aside, because a lot of theology in some sense gets in the way. You can talk about the Trinity, you can talk about the end of days, you can talk about the sacrifice that redeems sin, you can talk about all those things, but those are about things that were done for us and the state of the world, and things that God is in charge of. Really, what I'm in charge of is my life and what I'm supposed to do with my life. And if God incarnates himself and spends 3 years talking, he must want us to hear what he's actually saying and who he is. And, just like me talking to you, Shaun, you can see my gestures, you can look in my eyes, you can know if I feel uncomfortable or if I'm excited about something. You can see me. And that's what the experience I was trying to get out of the Gospels. And it was a very, very different way, putting aside the words of Paul, putting aside the words of the church, putting aside the theology of hundreds of years and 2,000 years. Suddenly you're just there with this guy and he's saying something to you, and it's urgently important enough for him to die for. And it really is transformative. I mean, it's a really new, for me, it was a new way, an original way to look at the Gospels.
And I think a place of comfort for many of us is approaching faith with almost kind of just accepting a blind faith and not going after a well-informed, a well-reasoned faith. I feel like that takes a certain bit of courage and bravery because we're afraid maybe sometimes of what we might find on the other side of that journey. For you, just coming out of your background, coming to faith at a later age and just wrestling through the years, if you haven't read or listened to his autobiography, it's phenomenal. I highly recommend that. Why is it important that we take that step? I feel like a lot of people are just afraid to cross that threshold because, even though they kind of operate from a place of just I have blind extreme faith, on the same time, they have their doubts and they don't want to necessarily come to terms with them.
Yeah, there's that. There's the fear that something will be undermined. When I wrote my memoir, you mentioned The Great Good Thing. I really did sit down, and the memoir kind of goes through the steps that drew me over decades to Jesus. And I did sit down thinking, what if it turns out I catch a mistake? Like going over my work, I see a mistake. And I was very gratified to see not only that there was no logical mistake, but also the presence of Christ was so apparent. When I told the story, I thought, oh, what an idiot I was not to have seen it before. And there's also something else. Religion is comforting and gives you a parameters to act in, and it gives you a certain certainty about life. And the interesting thing about Jesus when he starts talking is there's less certainty, but there's more love and more beauty. And one of the reasons it was so urgent to me, and one of the reasons I wanted so much to understand better, is that I feel like every time I understand, I become more joyful. And I always want to be careful in using that word. I don't mean happier, that I'm walking around with a big smiley face and talking about how blessed I am all the time, because I don't really feel like sometimes bad things happen and I'm sad. Sometimes good things happen and I'm happy. But joyfulness is sometimes the old poets called it gusto, a sense of life as being incredibly interesting and important and vital, and a sense of presence in the world that is just very awake and aware. And every time I understand something or feel that I understand something better in the Gospels, I become more joyful. I become more alive. And this is the thing that Jesus says. He says, I want the joy that's in me to be in you. And I'm like, okay, I'm in. I'm in for that. I love that about life, and I love life when it feels that way. And so I just thought, well, he can't just be saying, don't cheat on your wife or give money to charity. That can't, because I do all those things. I follow those rules, but like they're not the things that give me joy in life. Really, it's so much of just being here and seeing the world as Jesus wants you to see it that provides the joy. And I just want more of that. It's like a drug. I mean, It's what I see missing from the world, and I want it in my life. It's just too good to let go.
Yeah, I believe in the book you talked about when something clicks or there are those light bulb moments. It's like encountering a big bottle or bucket of happy sauce or something to that effect. I was like, that's a really great way to say it. So, I was kind of surprised when I saw this book come across my email from Zondervan. I don't know, several months back. I was like, man, how is he gonna? I was like, how do these two things come together? Like, I was excited to find out. Okay, how's Andrew going to pull this off? So, even a unique book, as somebody who's been in the Christian publishing space for so many years, a very unique project for Zondervan to take on. So, even that intrigued me as well. But in terms of kind of that era or that age of the English Romantics, like, what are some of the parallels, the similarities to our own era? Because I feel like one of the challenges we're walking through right now is people have such a complete ignorance of world history, church history, this, that, and the other thing, where whatever somebody tells you today just seems fine because you just don't have that context. And the reality is, everybody who's come before us has often seen the same systems at work, often solve the same problems that we're trying to solve. And so, kind of that idea that there's nothing new under the sun. Every time I look at history, I'm like, yeah, pretty much we've seen all this before. But in terms of our era, what's happening culturally, why are the English Romantics and what they did in literature a great place for us to spend some time to understand our culture today?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because it was the thing that kept me from writing the book for so long, is how am I going to explain the connection between these not religious poets? They were not religious poets. They were just terrific poets, and the Gospels. And what happened was, when I went back to reread the Gospels, just to get to know this man, just to say, who is he? What does he think? What does he see? How does he experience the world? What kept coming back to me were the words of these poets. I mean, you question a document, you question a text, you say, what are you saying to me? And the words that came back weren't always the words of the Gospels. They were frequently the words of these poets. And I started to think about that. And what I realized was that the age of the Romantic poets was incredibly like this age. I mean, it's almost uncanny, the parallels. We had this kind of revolution in the 60s where our entire culture changed. They went through the revolution that was the French Revolution, and it was obviously a violent revolution in France. But in the rest of Europe, it was this moment where everybody thought, oh, all the old ways are going to go away. It's the age of Aquarius. We're going to get rid of kings. We're going to get rid of priests. All this God stuff is going to go away. We're not going to be burdened by Christianity anymore. And all of a sudden, they found that they had a lot of new questions that they didn't have before. Was marriage the right thing? Were women actually different from men, or should they be treated the same? Was radical politics, could politics fix things and create this new paradise? That's what they thought the French Revolution was going to be, just like we thought the 60s was going to bring the age of Aquarius. They thought everything was going to change. And I think at the center of it all is, what do we do with the things that God gave us, that now that we don't believe in God anymore, how do we find them? So morality, the inner experience of being human. Do we have a soul? A lot of people were just saying this soul thing is ridiculous. Just like now, they were saying this whole soul thing. Now we have science. Science is going to explain everything. And it was, so gender, the soul. Does the soul exist? Does eternity exist? Can politics save us? All those things that we're dealing with now, they were dealing with then. And so you had these poets. And these, it's funny, you had philosophers in Germany who were trying to figure this out, but they're not really philosophical questions. They're really poetical questions, because they're about how we experience life. And these guys were basically standing in the rubble of what had been Christendom. The church had lost a lot of its favor. There had been wars between the Catholics and the Protestants. And they thought, well, where do we start? How do we begin again to have this inner life that we got through Christianity? And they started to rebuild the road. They started to build the road back toward Christianity. Now, most of them didn't know that that's what they were doing, but one of them did. The smartest one of them was a guy named Samuel Coleridge. He wrote the famous poem, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, from which we get phrases like water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink, or a sadder but a wiser man comes from that poet. It's a wonderful poem. And he was the one guy who kind of knew that Jesus Christ was at the center of this. And he moved like a spirit from poet to poet, inspiring each one. And it's really a wonderful, almost magical story that I don't think I've read just about every book on the Romantics there is. And I don't think anybody's quite told that story, the story of how this kind of genius of a man, he just knew everything, went from poet to poet, and he turned Wordsworth into the great poet that Wordsworth became. He inspired Mary Shelley in her writing of the book Frankenstein, which is one of the most profound books about gender you'll ever read. Not many people see it that way, but that's really what it is. And he inspired John Keats, the most beautiful, most talented, most tragic of the poets who died. He died in his early 20s, but having already written poetry as great as Shakespeare's. He inspired him when he was at the moment of greatest despair and darkness. Coleridge spoke to him, and suddenly he broke through and wrote some of the greatest poetry ever written. And so all of this, so what I did in the book is I tell the stories of these poets. I know that most people don't want to hear literary criticism. They don't want me picking apart the language. So I told the stories of what these poets, they're very dramatic stories, death and love affairs and drunken parties and all these wonderful ways that poets interact. And then having gone through what they invented, how they built this road back to faith, I go back to the Gospels. And the last maybe third of the book is just talking about the Gospels in light of their insights. And I found, I mean, I can only speak for myself, obviously, but I found a fresh hearing of Jesus's voice. His voice came to me now in ways that I could understand better. They weren't first century ways. I mean, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but we're not. We're not the same. We're not first century people. And so suddenly I was hearing his voice and thinking, these strange things that Jesus says, love your enemies. Really? Do we really want to do that? Or the one that always stops me when Peter walks on water and he starts to sink and Jesus says, oh, ye of little faith. And I think, are you joking? The guy walked on water. How much faith are you supposed to have? I wanted to understand, Jesus obviously was seeing something that we are not seeing. He was seeing the world in a way we're not seeing. And I came to really feel that that's what he was trying to tell us. He was trying to tell us how to see the world that way. Because when you see the world that way, the joy that's in him is in you. And I just felt these poets create a beautiful, their poetry is gorgeous. It's beautiful, but a beautiful bridge back to the truth. And that's one of the things that John Keats wrote. He said, beauty is truth and truth is beauty. And he didn't mean prettiness. He didn't mean things that are pretty or true. He meant things that are deeply wrapped up in the truth of life are beautiful. And when you create something that's truly beautiful, you will find that it's deeply wrapped up in the truth of life. And that brings me back to Jesus, who is, he said himself, he is the truth. He is the way and the truth and the life. And when you see through his eyes a little bit, it's an amazing experience.
Well, I think a side benefit or side effect that excites me about this book is you're going to introduce people who might have never picked up any of these other authors' books, poems, novels, whatever we want to say. And so I always get very enthusiastic because I think if I had a decent education, but I know some of the folks who came after I just did not encounter even half of what I was exposed to growing up, let alone how that it impacts your ability to do a little bit of critical thinking every now and then. But in terms of the people you introduce us to in the book, is there anyone that either, a discovery that really surprised you or, one of the things that you share that really kind of embodies sort of the core of the message you're trying to share in the book? Is there anybody that was just that you have that perfect example for you?
Well, the funny thing that happened to me is when I was a young man, I discovered John Keats, and he's this young, virile, excited poet who is he wants to make his name and he wants to make great poetry. And I was a young man and I was excited and I wanted to write great things. And so I identified with Keats very deeply. But now I found, as I've become an elder statesman, I found that Wordsworth had become a character that really I identified with. Wordsworth starts out as a radical. He travels to France during the Revolution and participates in kind of mild ways during the Revolution. But then the Revolution, the French Revolution, it's not like the American Revolution. It turns into this terror, people being guillotined. It then becomes a world war with Napoleon conquering most of Europe. And Wordsworth looked at this and thought, no, this was wrong. Now, to say that, just like today, to say like, oh, the woke people are wrong or leftism is wrong, he was canceled for it. He was viciously attacked. There are famous poems written about what a jerk Wordsworth was to abandon the radicalism of the French Revolution and to become essentially a conservative. And that's something I can really identify with because I had a very similar experience. I mean, grew up a liberal and suddenly started to say, well, gee, some of these things that I accepted all my life weren't true. And so I started out kind of thinking, well, I really identify with Wordsworth. But at the end, the thing that really did surprise me was this thing about Samuel Coleridge, who was a drug addict. He was a terribly broken man. He was a great poet for about 5 years, and then that stopped. And yet he was everywhere, like everywhere that people thought, that people changed, that people were awakened. He was there. Some people blamed him for driving people mad because he talked constantly. He did nothing but talk, and this genius would come pouring out of him, and it would affect people, you know. And Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, was a little girl, and she hid under the couch because Coleridge visited her house and read his great poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Wordsworth was lost and was not a great writer. And then he talked to Coleridge for a year and he became a great writer. And the thing about Coleridge was he was the one guy who did not let go of Christ. He was the one guy in this age of unbelief. It was an age when belief had become, just like today, it was a day when the default was to not believe, or at least to dismiss religion. He was the one guy, because he was the smartest guy, who just kept saying, no, you know, you have to have a base. You have to stand somewhere. And so he just became a very surprising presence. When I gave the book to my son to read, because my son kind of inspired me to write it, he said, well, you obviously like Coleridge more than anyone. And I thought, gee, I didn't feel that way when I was writing it, but he just kind of impressed himself upon me. Such a sad, broken guy, and yet so lovable in so many ways. Just a fascinating character.
Well, I think the place I'd like to land the interview in terms of my audience, all of my friends are authors or they're ministers, or that's largely the group I roll with. But whether we're talking people who are creating content for podcasts and video, we're writing. I wrote down in my notes, in an age of unbelief, kind of an entryway back to the faith. In terms of, could we be inspired by what you share in this book to start baking that more intentionally into everything that we're doing? Because as a guy who works in Christian publishing, I go, most of the people I encounter in culture, they're not going to go to Amazon and pick up a copy of the book that I'm helping to market or promote, but I can create an interview or create some other kind of content with an interesting person that they would actually listen to. And can we draw them towards the faith? So kind of, that's kind of the evangelical bent of my heart, wanting to reach the lost. But, rather than just being, we write Christian books, whatever it might be, could we take a few pointers from kind of the authors you share with us in the book and bake more of that into what we're doing? I don't even know how you're going to respond. I'm curious.
No, I think absolutely. First of all, I think it's a great question. I think the church, speaking of the church spiritual, I think the church is a little lost right now because we had it so good here in America for so long. It was kind of the center of our moral order, and now it's being rejected by the mainstream and by the elites and by the media. And on the one hand, you have a church that's desperate to be relevant and to make a difference. And we're going to make the world a better place. Well, the one thing you notice about Jesus is he never said the world is going to become a better place. He said, people hated me, and if you follow me, they're going to hate you, and the world is going to be tough. Give your money to the poor, but the poor you will always have with you. Follow me, and you're going to find a cross. You're going to have to pick up your cross and come with me. He never said the world was going to be a better place. And so part of the church has fallen into politics. And when I say fallen into politics, what I mean by that is politics are never going to take you to the answer. Good politics leave people free to find the answers, but that's the best they can do. You're not going to find paradise in politics. And that's one of the things that guys like Wordsworth learned. So that is a temptation that I think the church is facing on one side. And on the other side, you have a kind of grumpiness with the future, like don't let the future come. And my feeling about the future is A, it's going to come, and B, there's going to be two of them. There's not going to be one future. There's going to be two futures. There's going to be a future for those of us who have followed Christ, and a future for those who don't follow Christ and who go in a different direction. Those are going to be two different futures. And I think that to be grumpy about the future and to say, don't do this and don't do that, we know the world is going to do things that we don't like. And I think that the thing that we should be talking about is not so much what you shouldn't do. The rules for what you shouldn't do are preparation for what you should do, which is learn to see the world as God sees it. One of the things that was a revelation to me when I went back to it, because we know the gospel so well in a way that we don't hear it anymore, is Jesus says, love your enemies so that you will be like your Father in heaven. You will be a son to your Father in heaven, because he treats good and bad people the same. And I thought, oh, so it's not really about, being a nice, simpering guy in the face of evil. It's not really, you just let people walk all over you, or you let evil thrive, or you don't put people in prison when they have to go to prison. It's that you're supposed to see something the way God sees it. And when you start to do that, you are transformed, which is the best I think the church can do. And I think if more people stood up in the pulpit and said, this is what Jesus wants from you, not just to, don't cheat on your spouse. Of course, you shouldn't cheat on your spouse. You said you wouldn't, you shouldn't. Goes without saying, not just to be generous. We all know we have to do these things. But what does it mean to give away everything you have or to let go of everything? What does it mean in your specific life? And why is that a gain? Why is that a benefit? I almost never hear this kind of preaching, almost never. And I go to church every Sunday. And I have a wonderful priest. I love what he's talking about, but I almost never hear somebody say, this is your action plan for making the Andrew Clavin that you were given, the Andrew Clavin that God meant it to be. That's what I think Jesus is offering. I actually think that's what he's offering. And when you do that, I think that you hook into the eternity train. I think that person, that Clavin that I was made to be, is the eternal one. And I think the more I find him, the more I'll recognize him on the other side. And that's all the church can do. And the church should stop trying to be popular, should stop trying to be relevant, should stop trying to be big. It should start trying to be a place that people can come and find the person that God meant them to be. And I think that that's a kind of preaching that needs to come back because it's what everybody is so ravenous for. They'll turn to yoga, they'll turn to Buddhism, they'll turn to any fad that comes down the pike if it promises to give them themselves. But only God knows themselves and knows who they're supposed to be and knows who he made them. And I think Jesus is the way to find that. And I think I'd like to hear more people preach about that because I think that's what I found in the Gospels.
And Andrew, in terms of all of us connecting with you, your many books, all your content, where are some of the places we can discover you on the web?
You can get me at andrewclavin.com. It's Klavan. And I have a podcast on Fridays. So it's both political and cultural and religious on Fridays at the Daily Wire. Ben Shapiro's outfit. I have a podcast there. So you might want to check that out as well. But andrewclavin.com will lead you to most of my books. And of course, you can always tap in my name on Amazon finally.
And the whole time you're saying that, in my head, it's just going, there are no E's in Clavin. If you listen to his content, you can't miss that jingle. But like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. We'll have links in the show notes to Andrew's social media, his website, all the places you can buy the book, all the things. It'll be easy. You can just click on through. Sadly, it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Andrew Clavin. Once again, our book today was The Truth and Beauty. And Andrew, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
No, it was great talking to you, Shaun. It was a pleasure to meet you.